All right, guys. So we're back with our Q&A today. This one's going to be a fun one. It's going to be moving up weight classes, one that John and I are kind of known for, I guess you would say, especially with John's big jump from middles to heavies when he won his pro card. So let's set kind of a big framework first, and then we'll kind of dive into the details of it.
Yeah, so I think the first step is deciding that you actually do need to move up a weight class. And myself, as a personal example, is in 2015 I competed as a middleweight at USA's, and I was competing against guys that were shorter than me. So obviously, I didn't have the size to compete. I had to move up. Um, didn't have the intention of skipping a whole weight class when I was doing that, but just that's just what ended up happening within that process. So there wasn't necessarily a scale weight to target, but I knew I had to increase size, and setting the timeline for that would have been important. I had a year in mind, and just to add size into being a light heavy, but I went a little beyond. So I think setting the timeline for like how much size can you actually put on, how long do you really need to take to do this extended off-season time, and leaving it kind of tentative as well, because maybe you get there faster, maybe you need longer. So, so how would you start like looking at the timeline for someone? Probably
Well,
their level.
level of competition, right? So like if we have someone that's a little bit newer to competition, that there's still, quite a few weight classes below where they need to be, we may extend that out if they have the kind of patience to deal with that. But I guess one thing that I want to clarify is that when we're talking about setting a timeline, that's for your full all season, right? So when John says he went a little over a year, I would imagine, just based on the way I've been doing it, it's more a year to over a year of all season time. This is not between shows. So like what I see a lot of people say is they prep for 4 or 5 months and they said that there's a year between shows. But if you look at the all season time, a lot of times that's only what, 6, 7 months of all season, which I mean, you can make some improvements, but if we're talking jumping weight classes, like that's a clear distinction, right? So when I jumped from 175 on stage to 200 last year, um, that was like a year and a quarter process of just off season before we even started prep, right? So I
And
think
you're someone that's like had it all. Like, you have to look at what this person has done previously. Like, are
yeah,
they hitting all the marks in training? Okay, your training is flawless. Like, and you're training with a lot of effort and everything's right as far as your programming. Okay, well, you've already checked that block, so that's not an area we can improve on further. So that's going to make some slower progress. Like, how's your nutrition? All right, you've been slacking here or there. Like, we can tighten that up. Maybe that'll be some more novelty we're adding to some greater progress. Maybe there's recovery variables that we can look at too. All right, this guy he's not sleeping at night. We can improve sleep, and then in turn improve training. And then looking at also like what's their level of anabolic usage, how far have they gone down that path? Are they beginner? And then just looking at the timeline of when they've been doing all of this. So if you've been doing everything perfect, you've had your first year of training, maybe you have put on like 20 pounds of weight. What I usually see, it's almost like a cut in half every year after.
yeah,
So your second year, maybe you could add 10 pounds of muscle on, and then 5. Then at that point, it's probably within that 3 to 5 per year until you get to advanced level. If you've never used anabolics, once you introduce those, it's kind of like reopening that channel again
it's a
to where you
jumping
could jump
point.
up 20 pounds. So you have to think like, where in that process are you as far as true advancement? Like, what I would say is like, this past year, how productive were you? Did you already add 20 pounds of stage weight and you're training good? You're using all the right stuff, supplementation wise, sleeping good. So, well, you're probably not going to be add on another 20 pounds. And that might look like 7 to 10 pounds. And so if that's what that year process would look like, well, is that enough time for you to move up a weight class? Maybe you're going to have to extend that out further, right?
Right. And within those considerations too, I think that what doesn't get taken into consideration enough is the outside factors, right? We have people that will train hard and maybe their nutrition be overly pretty good, but like their outside life is extremely stressful. They're not taking care of sleep, things like that, right? And that's still leaving stuff on the table. Like that could make huge improvements on the rate of progress, even though you may have a pretty relative good training history. under your belt. So with those considerations, that will change your timeline some. Now, I think one thing to consider as well is height relative to weight class, right? So no matter how competitive you were the last time, talking on the local regional level, then you may want to look at like how you stack up against people in your weight class. Because one thing you pointed out, John, was that you were standing against people that were 2 and 3 inches shorter than you. And that was the same thing that happened to me this year. This is the whole reason I'm taking the time to jump up to heavyweights. And so if we kind of look into the factors that are going to play into that, training and nutrition and sleep are the three that we've already mentioned, but digestion is another one too over the long term. And I think that with the pushing food thing that has to happen with off seasons, there needs to be a process set for the long-term timeline. So we're looking at probably for most people, a push-up process and then a stabilization process to re-solidify that weight, right? So one thing that I would put as a caveat is that solidification of weight needs to be as detail oriented as the push-ups, because this is where you're going to change your body composition at the same weight in order to set yourself up for the next push, which in my opinion is probably even more important than the push process, because then things come easy. We're introducing more anabolics, we're introducing more food. Progress comes like checking boxes extremely easy. And so like, what are some things that you see that help with that push stabilization fluctuation over time?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that. One of the things that always stuck in my mind when from that 15 to 16 where I had that big jump was working with Matt Jansen, and he during that like cruise period where you're bringing your supplementation down, you're not going to be seeing rapid progress. If anything, you're just maintaining. He's like, man, John, the reason you've made such great progress is because in this period you continue to train hard as possible. Like nothing changes for your execution. And so I think that was a big part is that I didn't have a change in mindset moving into this push-up phase into more of a maintenance phase where supplementation's down. It's like, and you think like, I can't make progress anymore. It's like, no, this is part of your progress is the solidification process. And maybe you still can make progress. It just is going to be at a slower rate, but continue training with effort and not thinking going into sessions like, oh man, my strength should be down. I don't have this and that in play. It's like, no, I want to make it there. I'm gonna force the adaptation to be there. And I think continuing with training effort is a big thing too. Now, I think a part of this also is you chase the scale in these, and you might see your weight change a little bit in these cruise periods, or your weight's not changing, but your composition's changing. Maybe you're getting a little softer. You can't process foods as efficiently. And that might influence how you change your nutrition as well, for the bad, or it could be for the worst too.
Yeah.
So I think within any phase, it's so important along this is that if you're doing this on your own, you're taking pictures and measurements and caliper sites to have some good subjective and objective data to really know what's going on. Like if you're adding on body fat right now, well, then you need to make a program adjustment to stay leaner as you're pushing up. Because if you get really fat really quick, this extended off season is going to have to be reduced down. You're going to have to go back into a cutting period. And I think that is another process. Part of it is slowly pushing up and having the variables to track so you can make those accurate changes along the way. But within that cruise period, I think that's the difficult one, especially with enhanced lifters, because it's not as clear as like scale weight's going up and I'm looking better. It's like scale weight might be the same and I'm looking worse, or it drops down and now I look worse. What do I do? So I think that's a part where it's important to like have good assessment tools to look at and keep mentally strong and see out that long-term vision.
Yeah, and with that tracking too, the goal here is obviously to not only stabilize where you're at, but set up the next push. And I don't think that goes through people's heads. And if it did, it would become a part of the process that is so much more important to them. Because if we're already dealing with like insulin sensitivity issues before we even start pushing, or at the start of a push, because body fat's too high, maybe estrogen's climbing up too much because of the higher body fat percentage, right? Like you're going to be dealing issues like 8 weeks into a push that are going to be really hard to combat. And just taking those tracking measures is going to be very important. Now, I primarily use pictures, but I know, John, you like the calipers alongside the pictures as well. Is there anything else you're using? And are you trying to keep like a certain weight range between on that push? So like if you end at like 230 at the end of a push, like trying to stay within 5 pounds within that, or is that going to kind of vary between individual more?
I mean, it still is going to vary. So the main tools that I do use are just my pictures, all circumference measures, and of course, if you're consistent, that will help. And then caliper measures, and it's not just like your standard caliper measures. Like I measure spots that I accrue the most body fat on. So my lower back, I'll measure my glute and also my subscap. So I'll stay 5 millimeter, like all on my front side, but then my lower back will be adding 2-3 millimeters a week, you know? So, but if you're not measuring those spots, you won't even know. So those are my main ones. Like, hey, if I want to build up my arms, well, I better see the damn arm tape measure increasing. Like you might not notice a 1/4 inch change in your arms week to week, but you will in a tape measure. But anyway, yeah. So those are the tools that I do use. Um, as far as a fluctuation from moving from a blast to a cruise period, it is very dependent. Like I think you mentioned estrogen. Some people have more issues with aromatization
Yep.
and retaining water, and then also depending if I'm thinking enhanced, because this is when it really is making these fluctuations change. Like if
Right.
you jump onto a blast phase and you see right away that first 1 to 2 weeks you have this large jump in body weight, 3-5 pounds, you're not putting on 3-5 pounds of tissue, you're also increasing water and glycogen storage, so that's likely going to drop off at the very end when you bring dosages back down.
Right.
So that's something to consider. Like keep that in mind when you start a blast, and then 10 weeks down the road, you decrease dosage. Like, oh my gosh, I dropped 10 pounds. Well, that first 10 pounds you put on was probably a bunch of water. That might be also consideration of how you're planning out your blast as well. So that's what I would look at too. Like if you do drop off quick, well, it's probably just water retention. Don't let that get in your head, because that actual like contractile tissue added on is still going to be there. And
Right.
so look at your strength variables, because those would be good ones to look at. If you're able to still maintain performance in the gym, that's probably a better indicator of what the quality of tissue that you're retaining.
And one thing I would kind of make as a suggestion to people is don't be afraid of a couple weeks of a slight pull down leading into a pushing period, because like even if you are taking 3 to 4 weeks to just kind of bring things down, you're not gonna lose muscle tissue, but you probably can set yourself up a little bit better for coming back up. And I do this a lot with my natural clients, is like a short little mini cut for 4 to 6 weeks before we start bringing it up again, because uh, the fluctuations are a little bit less, obviously. But I also do it with my enhanced as well, just because everything's going to function a little bit better if and now these are people that kind of, you see that nutrient partitioning issues start to become a really big issue, and there's big calorie discrepancies between the push and the plateau phase, right? So we may pull back a little bit for 4 to 6 weeks right before we come back up.
Yeah, I do the same thing too. So if I get someone to come out of a push and they can hold that weight well, and I know everything's cleared out supplementation wise, it's like, okay, I can pull down food and they're going to hold easy. And we can also keep health markers in a good spot, because if you're not healthy, you're not going to grow efficiently, but also you're going to have to pull back at some point because your health's just going to shit. So I think that's a good way to keep health markers in a good spot, go into a next push to be really productive, and keep that long-term process extending before you have to do something really big to take you out of that long-term phase.
Right. And the thing here is longevity. So John made a great point about the health. Like as you do come up in body weight, it's going to be harder to track those health markers, especially things like blood pressure and things like that, as your body weight gets increasingly above the point where your body really wants to be. So make sure you're tracking those as well. Everything with jumping a weight class is about making it as efficient as possible over the long term. So make sure you keep track of everything. Don't get too far off as far as your off season goes. Make sure your health markers are in check. Set yourself up well for each time you do come up so that the efficiency of these push-ups are the best they can possibly be.